Stories are the most powerful thing on earth. They are literally life and death. Wars are waged based on the story of who is the hero and who is the villain. You are the result of a story your parents told each other, the one-night stand, the soulmate, and friends who became so much more. Life and death. So wouldn't you like to understand them better, these stories? How Story Works, an elegant guide to the craft of storytelling by Lani Diane Rich, demystifies stories and helps you understand why you love what you love, why you hate what you hate, and why prologues are almost always a bad idea. How Story Works by Lani Diane Rich. Available on Amazon in ebook, audiobook, and paperback form. Get your copy today.
Now, we can do this the hard way or, well, actually, there's just the hard way.
Seize the moment, because tomorrow you might be dead.
Okay, Vessel Boy, you want blood?
It's not going to be pretty. We're talking violence, strong language, adult content.
Excuse me, I have to call everyone that I've ever met right now.
The earth is doomed.
All right, let's do this thing. Welcome to Still Pretty. I'm story expert Lani Diane Rich of Chipperish Media.
And I'm film scholar Noelle LaCroix.
And we're here today to talk about Welcome to the Hellmouth and The Harvest, the first 2 episodes of Season 1. Welcome to the Hellmouth and The Harvest were both written by Joss Whedon, with story editor credits going to Matt Kine, Joe Reichemeyer, Jean Batali, and Rob Desautels.
Welcome to the Hellmouth was directed by Charles Martin Smith, who only directed this one episode of Buffy. And The Harvest was directed by John T. Kretschmer, who would return for only one other episode, Season 2's School Hard. All right, let's go on patrol.
In the 2-part series opener of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, 16-year-old Buffy Summers starts school in her new town of Sunnydale. And at first, things go pretty well. The school's resident cool girl, Cordelia, likes her, and she meets Willow and Xander. But then...
Gym was canceled due to the extreme dead guy in the locker.
After investigating and discovering that the dead kid was killed by a vampire, she rushes to the library to report the events to Mr. Giles, the school librarian who seems to know about these things.
You think it's coincidence you're being here? That boy was just the beginning.
Oh, why can't you people just leave me alone?
Because you are the Slayer.
Determined to live a normal life, Buffy goes to the Bronze to socialize. On the way, she meets a dark-haired mystery man in an alley who warns her about the vampires and gives her a silver cross necklace.
You've got to be ready.
What for?
For the harvest.
At the Bronze, she bumps into Willow, and then is found by Giles, who insists that she fulfill her destiny and be on the lookout for vampires.
You have to hone your senses, focus until the energy washes over you, until you feel every particle of it.
There's one.
Buffy sees Willow go off with a vampire and gives chase, but the vampire escapes with Willow. Buffy tells Giles she'll take care of it, then goes into the alley and bumps into Xander, who reveals what he overheard in the library.
Oh, hey, I hope he's not a vampire, because then you might have to slay him.
Buffy gets beat up by an uncommonly large vampire named Luke, escapes, rescues Willow and Xander, fails to rescue Jesse, and reports in to Giles to discover that the harvest is the ritual through which a vessel will kill a lot of people, thus empowering the Master to break free of his mystical prison.
She mustn't be allowed to interfere with the harvest.
Buffy realizes that the entrance to the underground lair is in the mausoleum and decides to go back in and take the bad guys out. The mystery man, whose name we discover is Angel, shows up to mock her. And then Xander shows up to be, really of no help at all. They find Jesse, which is great, except now he's a vampire, which is not great. They barely make it out alive. Back at home, Buffy's getting ready to go out and stop the apocalypse when Joyce comes in and grounds her.
If you don't go out, it'll be the end of the world. Everything is life or death when you're a 16-year-old girl.
Buffy sneaks out the window and makes it to the Bronze, where Luke and a group of vampires have taken everyone hostage and begun feeding. Just as they're about to feed on Cordelia, Buffy interrupts the party, dusts the vampires, and saves the day. The Master is still underground, but he's stuck there. For now.
At school the next day, Buffy, Willow, Xander, and Giles form their core team, knowing that the only thing that stands between the world and a bloody apocalypse is the four of them. All right, so you haven't watched Buffy for like 10 years.
At least.
We're talking about Welcome to the Hellmouth and the Harvest. What did you think about it coming back into it now?
So it's been at least 10 years since I've watched the show. Coming back in, I was really struck by how subversive it still seems, especially with that cold open. You know, we established the high school as this dark place of suspense and horror with long, dark hallways and animal skeletons in the biology lab. And then the first spoken line is Darla, who says, are you sure this is a good idea? Right. And that felt just a little bit self-aware to me. I was struck by how self-aware the show seemed to be right off the bat, coming in from the movie, presumably. But I want to talk about the cold open because it's just so cool. I really, really love it. We have this. So it ends with this moment with this pretty blonde, apparently fearful girl who becomes the monster.
Right.
And that feels like the show in a nutshell to me.
Right. It's subverting those expectations because when we see a pretty blonde girl in any horror context, especially if she has had the audacity to, you know, have sex or have a sexual thought or be with a boy alone in a dark hallway, she has to die.
Exactly.
Right? She has to be punished because she is not chaste. Right?
Yeah.
So any girl with any kind of sexual existence at all, let alone the blonde, it's always a blonde girl. You know, there's nothing a horror movie loves more than killing the pretty blonde girl, you know. And here we have this instant subversion of that, you know, not just that the thing that we get with Buffy is, of course, that she's the pretty blonde girl who always gets killed, except that she's actually, you know, the thing the monsters are afraid of, which is another subversion of that trope. But right here from the beginning, we get this cute little blonde girl, right, who seems afraid, who seems scared, you know, who's there with a boy who is, you know, behaving in a somewhat predatory manner himself, right? Don't worry, it's fine. Come on with me, that kind of thing, that sort of coercive sort of teenage boy thing, right? And then she ends up being the monster. She ends up taking him out, you know, and he ends up dying as punishment for that, you know, patriarchal coercion, that sexual aggression and coercion that we usually see, you know, in boys go unpunished. So in this cold open, immediately we've got like a million different things that we're dealing with, a million different messages that we're both sending and subverting.
Definitely. And that guy is such a douche. I'm so glad he gets eaten.
I mean, I want to say, like, I don't think that a teenage boy who is sexually coercive should necessarily be killed for it. But I do feel like sending the message that that's a bad thing is not a bad thing.
Yeah. Well, and he tries to scare her, too. It's not just that she says, oh, I'm not so sure about that. And he's like, come on, it'll be fine. He's also, he's being creepy intentionally
trying to scare her. Bringing her into the room with the skeletons of the animals and all of that stuff.
Well, and full disclosure, this totally got me. It totally got me because he's there. I mean, he's even lurking over her shoulder in prime vampire position.
Right.
Until she spins around and bites him. And I remembered that Julie Benz played a recurring character on the show. But I decided that this douche bro was a vampire who was going to bite her and make her a vampire. And surprise, the girl is a monster. And I loved that. I loved re-experiencing that reveal because, of course, we have that horror staple of the pretty blonde girl. And we can thank Hitchcock for that, by the way. We've got this, you know, the pretty blonde girl turned on, you know, that horror staple turned on its ear with Buffy. But this moment feels even more subversive than that to me. It feels even more subversive than cheerleader a superhero because it takes this ingenue and it makes her ugly.
Oh, right.
And I don't want to yuck anyone's yum. If vamp face is your thing, that is awesome.
Right.
But I think we're meant to read Darla as unattractive and scary. And I think that is really noteworthy. This is a television show that is going to allow its conventionally attractive supporting actress to look awful. And that tells us something about what we're going to see. That tells us something about what we're going to experience on the show as a whole. Because female ugliness, especially the sudden appearance of female ugliness, is still shocking. Because patriarchy.
Yes, exactly. Because we will not allow that. Exactly.
But that ugliness is also a metaphor for the ugly emotions and the ugly situations that we're going to encounter as we focus on Buffy and her experience, not just as the Slayer, but as a young woman.
Well, yeah, and that's really interesting too, because, in this opening moment, we're seeing her when she's pretty, she's weak, and she's, being super feminine and very submissive and all that kind of stuff. But as soon as she claims her power, she becomes ugly. Now, that's not something that we're going to see as a message in Buffy, because Buffy is powerful all throughout and she remains, uncommonly beautiful all throughout. So it's not like we're sending that message. But I think it is kind of interesting, and when we come down to the ugliness of the vampire, I mean, the first vampire we see is a female vampire. The vast majority of the vampires we're going to interact with are male vampires, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. Because the whole idea of the vampire, right? The vampire is seductive. There's this sexy element to vampirism. There's an association with vampirism and sex, of course, all throughout the history of the tales of the vampire. So we have this idea of vampires being sexy, being associated with sex. All of these vampires, the vast, vast majority, I haven't gone through and counted them all, but the female vampire is of fairly rare phenomenon. We don't see a whole lot of them. But vampires are constantly turning each other, right? So it means that all these men are turning other male vampires into other male vampires, that we're associating this particular kind of power with a very particular male kind of energy. But when you think about vampires turning each other, usually it depends on, we are very heteronormative, extremely heteronormative for at least the first few seasons of Buffy anyway. And so it's interesting that they're all men, they're all turning each other. It seems to me like vampirism is a big, hot gay bar, right? I mean, it should be, right? Because this is a very, very sexual thing.
There's definitely some sexy vibes with Luke and the Master. But
sure.
I was interested because I was watching for that, especially when Luke is feeding on the bouncer.
Yes.
I was waiting for that to be much more homoerotic than it was. It looked...
Well, deliberately homoerotic. I think it was inadvertently homoerotic.
But it was not...
Right.
Yes, of course it was homoerotic, but it wasn't objectified in a sexy sort of way.
Right.
Because that would be way too subversive, right?
But there's a very sensual relationship between Luke and the Master. We have this moment where Luke is kissing the Master's hand, and that in that moment feels sexual. And then we have where the Master is painting Luke's forehead and making him into a vessel.
Yes.
Right? Also feels a little sexy. And I don't think that they were deliberately going for that. And we're going to see throughout the run of Buffy some troublesome, treatment of homosexuality. And even when we do it well, when, Willow, of course, comes out in season 4, there's still some questionable political places. There's some questionable, I think, presumptions about homosexuality and all of that kind of stuff. But we do have that undertone here. And I think we see it kind of lying underneath in this sort of subtextual way, but in the way that it's shot, in the way that it's performed. There's a very sensual element to this relationship between Luke and the Master. And notice that it is not Darla, who is Luke's second. Even though Darla is the first one that we meet, Darla is the one that we give the most personality to. Darla is the vampire who we see in non-vampire face.
Yes.
Right? aside from Angel, who we don't know is a vampire
Right.
just yet. Darla's the only vampire that we see in non-vampire phase, and Jesse when we're not sure that he's a vampire yet. So it's interesting how Darla, despite the fact that she's the one who is probably given the most personality, the most character, aside from the Master as far as the bad guys go, but it's Luke who is the second in command. It's Luke who is the vessel. It's Luke who shows the power. He's the one who attacks Buffy in the mausoleum, right? And he's the big guy who has never been, nobody's ever attacked me since 1840, whatever, right? I find that kind of an interesting choice, because how much more interesting would it have been if we had allowed Darla to have that level of power as well?
That would have been really interesting. But then I wonder about because we are so heteronormative and so heterosexist, I wonder if the vibe between the Master and Darla would have read as even more sexual. I wonder if there...
Yeah.
I guess what I'm wondering is how much of a sexy vibe does the show want us to have around vampires? It's a non-zero amount of sexy vibe.
Well, I mean, it's Angel. Like, Angel is going to be the ultimate representation of the sexy vibe throughout the first 3 seasons, at least until Faith gets there.
Yes.
At which point, Faith becomes the delivery system for sexy.
It is interesting to me that Darla is not the second in command, because she, of all of the vampires, seems to be the one who has her shit together.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that is interesting and noteworthy too. But I noticed that when Buffy is fighting, Darla is also the first real fight scene that we get with Buffy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Buffy, when she enters the mausoleum, is not afraid of Darla. She is talking smack. She is,
she's clipping. Yeah.
With Darla. But Luke scares her. When she's fighting with Luke, he's genuinely scary. And he is genuinely scary. I mean, he's a
big dude. Like, just his physical presence is huge.
Oh, and his biceps are as big around as her neck. I mean, it's terrifying.
I know.
And he is she's got the stake. She comes at him with the stake, and he crushes it in his hand. Yeah. So we definitely have some interestingly gendered dynamics going on here.
Yeah.
That this big, meathead bro of a vampire is he's the scariest thing.
Well, right. And then we end that episode. We end Welcome to the Hellmouth with him descending upon her, in this supine posture, which is not, it's not reminiscent of rape. Right. So we open up with sexual coercion, with this kind of, I guess, more innocent sense of sexual coercion with Darla and the boy that she would ultimately stuff in a locker. And then we have Luke with this much more directly, coercive, much more, reminiscent, much more pulling out this kind of rape metaphor, right? And, as long as we're talking about rape metaphors, right, the stake to the heart is a penetration, right? And that is that, like, I mean, as long as we're going there, let's go ahead and go there. Like, is that kind of the reversal of this? The women are the ones that get raped. The women are the ones who get penetrated. The women are the ones that are being coerced. And then we have this way of fighting back by sticking that piece of wood into the heart of the male vampire, the vampires who are typically male. So I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm riding that horse a little too far outside of the barn. But
oh no, you're not. We can let's go there, shall we? Shall we go there? Because
let's do it.
I want to get all psychoanalytic on this so bad.
Right. Well, you had notes about this kind of Freudian stake, so let's go ahead and talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I don't think it's a coincidence at all that the stake is so obviously it's crucial to fighting vampires, right? We know this from the mythology around vampires.
Sure.
But it's the first marker of Buffy as the Slayer. She has that interaction with Xander in the hallway. And it goes horribly wrong for him. He's just completely bumbling. And
Right.
it ends with the steak falling out of her bag. And he says, "You forgot your steak." And he holds it up with this kind of what the fuck look, which, to be fair, is story appropriate, right?
Right.
But we've just had this scene with Xander being a complete bumbling idiot, trying to hit on Buffy, and it totally failing. And the scene ends with him holding a phallic symbol like he's never seen it before.
Right. I don't understand what this is when it's pointed at me.
What is this? What is this powerful device? I mean, I think we're definitely using the stake and the it's not a coincidence that we're using the phallic symbol as a marker of power, as representative of power. But on Buffy, we have the phallus as a symbol of feminine power, which is fascinating to me. And
taking control of that symbol. Wow. Yeah, that's interesting.
And it's not just that moment. It's not just that moment with Xander and I don't know what to do with this long pointy device.
Right. I've never been on this end.
I don't know what this is.
Long pointy thing before.
When the first time we see a stake used, I love this so much. The first staking of the first vampire on Buffy the Vampire Slayer happens when Buffy pulls the stake out of her shirt. We get a neck to navel close up of her hand reaching between her breasts to pull the stake out. It's she's got it between her t-shirt and her button front. And that feels so heavy-handed to me. That feels like this is what we're doing. This is the power, the control, the previously male energy in this space, in the space of the show, belongs to the female body. Right. And there's some subtle indications of that as well. When Buffy and Willow are talking about calling the police, Buffy says they'd only come with guns. So we have guns as this symbol of patriarchal masculinity, which, of course, point and shoot. And they are ineffective in this female power-centered world. When Buffy needs a stake and doesn't have one, she breaks off a chair leg first, which is, we have furniture as a symbol of domesticity. And then the second time she needs a stake and doesn't have one, she breaks off a tree branch, which connects her to nature. So we're taking these feminine spaces and we're drawing the power from them. Literally, we're breaking up these feminine spaces and symbols as a source of power. And I think that is one place where the feminism of the show really holds up. Like,
the feminism of the show is a really interesting thing because I think a lot of times it is almost an accidental feminism. And then sometimes sometimes it buries itself into the patriarchy so much. Like it's got so much patriarchal influence, which of course anything in our culture does, because our culture is a patriarchal culture. These things end up in our storytelling. There's a concept that I use a lot when I talk about stories. You'll hear me talk about this over in my storytelling podcast, How Story Works, where I talk about this concept of terroir. Now, terroir comes from wine growing, right? Where whatever the flavors are in the soil where the seed of the grape is planted, those flavors are going to come up in the grape and they're going to find their way into the wine, right? And and it's not deliberately done. It's just that's what's in the soil at the time that this is planted. So here we have, you know, Buffy coming up from a highly patriarchal, a very racist. I mean, we are, as a culture, as a country, really, you know, kind of imbued with both white supremacy and the patriarchy, two very, very, very bad influences. We're going to be talking about
the show
both
has
as
a
we
huge
move
race
through
problem,
talking
which
about the show. It does, as so many stories, especially from this era, do, and a lot of that is terroir. You know, it's not to say that we don't have a responsibility to both see it and reject it, but a lot of this stuff comes up, I think, without a conscious understanding or a deliberate intent from the creators of these stories. It just happens. It just throws it. It just ends up in the soil. You know, so part of the thing that that I love doing with Buffy, and why I'm so excited to have these discussions with you, because you see things that I've missed. I've missed this whole time, her pulling the stake from her shirt, you know, from her bosom, which is one of the things that when you're interacting with a man as a woman who has grown up in America, you of course are familiar with this. You're interacting with a man. He wants to minimize you. What does he do? He drops his eyes to your breasts. He reminds you that you're a woman, you know, and then that is something that sets that power dynamic. You know, you're a woman. Don't forget you're a woman. I will objectify you at any time. Right. So she takes the source of objectification, the most ready and obvious source of objectification that men tend to go to, and pulls from it the phallic symbol of power. Right? I mean, that in itself right there is worth the price of admission, right?
Absolutely it is.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit. Can we talk a little bit about objectification?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that was something that I was on the lookout for right from the get-go. I was really interested in, you know, Buffy has this reputation as a feminist text, and I'm like, yeah, well, but it's a mainstream television show. And it's a mainstream television show featuring high school aged girls. What are we going to be, how are we going to approach the physical bodies of these young women as we're talking about them? And I was both disappointed and not disappointed by how male gazy Buffy is. I mean, do you know what I mean when I talk about the male gaze?
I do, but why don't you go ahead and explain it for people who haven't heard that term before?
Okay, let me talk a little bit about the male gaze. So the male gaze, and I'm going to talk about this. You're going to get sick of hearing me talk about the male gaze. So the male gaze. Feminist film critic Laura Mulvey coined the term male gaze in 1975 to describe the act of showing the world and women in cinema and the visual arts from a heterosexual masculine point of view. The male gaze presents women as objects of cis heterosexual male desire. And that ends up meaning that in general, on screen, men act and women appear. We've already talked a little bit about how that is not the case on Buffy. Buffy is very active, but there are multiple viewpoints of the male gaze. There are 3 viewpoints within the male gaze: the people behind the camera, the characters within the film or television show, and the spectators. And I'm going to be talking about male gaze and all of those as we do this podcast, because it's very, very interesting to me. So I was really interested in just how male gazy is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And in this, in the first 2 episodes, not terribly, but it's not male gazy either.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
Xander.
oh, God.
Xander immediately, from the moment Buffy shows up on the screen, he wants her. He's got a thing for her. And I mean, yes, she's a beautiful girl. But like at that point, like Buffy is so much more than a beautiful girl. She's so much more than that. At that point, though, that is the only thing that is the only information that Xander has about her, is that she's a beautiful girl. And instantly he is converted into this, you know, trying to impress her, you know, kind of following her around. You know, I mean, there's just a whole bunch of stuff there with the way that Xander, basically, because she's beautiful, he's instantly into her with nothing else, requires nothing else of her. So because all he requires from her is her appearance, every interaction he has with her until he knows who she is, until he starts interacting with her as the Slayer, is essentially at its heart male gazy.
Absolutely.
Isn't it?
And Xander gives us our first true point of view shot on the show. The first point of view shot that we get is the students moving out of the way of his out of control skateboard, which, I mean, that feels pretty heavy handed on the symbolism too, that he's introduced just sailing down the sidewalk, making everyone else move to get out of his way.
The very picture of male entitlement.
And he's polite about it. He's kind of, I think we're meant to see it as charming, you know, move please, but it's still entitlement. And we get the point of view shot of everyone getting out of his way so that he doesn't crash into them, because he's not making any attempt to stop that skateboard. And then the next point of view shot that we get is also Xander. He crashes his skateboard because he's looking at Buffy, and the camera is looking at her from behind. But she's shot mostly from the waist up. So we see her back and we see her long blonde hair. But even though it's not an especially sexy shot, I think the audience is still supposed to understand it as Xander checking her out and being, distracted enough by her appearance that he wipes out on his skateboard. And I can't with Xander. I have so much Xander hate. And I want to tread so carefully about what I hate on this show, but oh God.
No, it's okay. And here's the thing. Like, okay, let's go ahead and address Xander.
Can we? I know you have
right away
things with Xander. I want to hear your.
I have complicated feelings about Xander. I have very complicated feelings about Xander. First of all, like there are two Xanders, right? There is the conscious Xander, and when I say conscious, I mean like as far as like what the writers knew they were doing with Xander. What I believe the writers to know what they were doing with Xander. Obviously, I can't know what the intent was at the time that he was written, and what the unintentional sort of shadow side of Xander that comes along with that. And part of that is it has been noted a number of times. Joss Whedon has said that Xander is him. Xander is a representation of himself. And given things that have come out about Joss Whedon in recent times, where we find him to be a very problematic figure with regard to women, that sometimes the people who claim the loudest feminism are not the best feminists. So Xander I love Xander in the following ways. I love that he's funny. I love that he's a beta male, because I love me a beta male. Those are always fun. Like for those of you who are unfamiliar with the idea of the alpha male versus the beta male, the alpha male is the tough, in charge, the Luke, right? You know, and Xander, the beta male, is the funny, smart, thoughtful guy, right? So I like those things about Xander. What happens with Xander, and we're going to see this repetitively throughout the entire run of Buffy, it does get a little bit better toward the end. But when I say toward the end, I'm talking like, you know, season 7. Like we get some of Xander's best stuff in season 7. But what we get are these kind of this light side of Xander and then shadow Xander. So light Xander I love funny, smart, witty, loyal, a good friend, you know. I love all that stuff about Xander. But then we get the shadow side that I didn't even see for the first few times I ran through Buffy. Like I didn't even notice it. But the shadow side is the sexually entitled side, the side that treats women, especially women he dates as we move forward in the series, dismissively, and is very patriarchal and superior with them. With women he has no business being superior with at all, and he's incredibly like problematic, I think, as far as like representing toxic masculinity in a lot of ways. And I feel like it's folded into him in sort of this subconscious way, in the same way that we see Joss Whedon, you know, extra textually, because Joss Whedon is not part of Buffy. He is the creator of Buffy, but Buffy also belongs to the hundreds of people who have also worked on Buffy who never did anything wrong, you know. So I mean, it becomes a problem if you completely lay this all at Joss Whedon's feet. But I believe that it is nascent with Joss Whedon, that it comes from him and his personality. That the shadow side has no consequence. The shadow side is often used for a joke. You know, because isn't it funny the way that Xander feels entitled to these women? You know, so we have all of this really problematic stuff with Xander, but at the same time, like, light side Xander, I love. Shadow side Xander exists without consequence, predominantly without consequence. We almost never see consequence. So it's not a problem in a story to have a character who has that shadow side, who behaves in these ways. This is representative of very real things that we deal with in our society and our culture all the time. The problem is when those things exist outside of consequence, that when those things exist and come in and are presented in the text of the show as though they are completely acceptable and there's not a problem with this kind of behavior at all. That's where I have my problem with Xander. But because I feel like the conscious intent of Xander is light Xander, and that shadow Xander is something that sort of comes along, it sort of hitches a ride on the Xander that I love. My feelings about Xander are extremely complicated, although even I don't care for him much at all in these opening episodes.
No, he's just... I am giving Xander the side-eyediest side-eye that ever side-eyed.
Right.
I mean, Xander in these opening episodes, I feel like is the epitome of the entitled, whiny dude. And I love that you keep talking about the shadow side of Xander, because we see his shadow before we see him.
Wow. Oh my God.
We see his shadow on the sidewalk, and then the camera comes up to see who this is.
The shadow is the anchor of Xander.
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
God.
and I think you're absolutely right that a lot of Xander is meant to be adorable. Like his first words to Buffy, "Can I have you?"
Yes.
The Freudian slip that's supposed to be he, like he's...
And isn't that cute? Can I have you? Can I possess you? Can I take ownership of you because you are an object?
Yeah, and when Willow and Buffy are having lunch together and Xander climbs over a wall to get between them and sit above them.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the thing. This is the thing about film and television. These decisions are made on purpose. They may not be made consciously. But they are made on purpose. Anything you see in a fictional space, somebody chose.
Somebody did choose it, and they may not have consciously chosen it to be. That's why a lot of times when we go this deep into analysis, right? A lot of people are like, well, they didn't mean to do that. That just happened. There is nothing just happening. Like, even if people didn't deliberately mean to do it this way, the fact that they made that choice comes from the impetus to make that choice for whatever conscious reasons they might have had, also has subconscious reasons, also has things that they are not aware of. Shadow Xander is not a deliberate thing written into this story, but Shadow Xander exists.
Absolutely.
It is there. And the fact that it's subconscious makes it even more powerful and I think more illustrative. So I'm sorry, I interrupted
not at all.
You. Keep going. I'm fascinated.
No, not at all. That's absolutely, I mean, it is, I think that that's something that is really crucial to point out, that a lot of this is not, we didn't have our directors going, okay, now we're going to have Xander literally cross a physical boundary and hover over them to make himself more powerful in this situation. No, that was not what was done. It wasn't, I don't think. I'm imagining.
I don't believe that was a conscious or deliberate decision. Right.
But that kind of decision, the reason that blocking makes sense is because it makes sense within a space where we're used to that sort of patriarchal entitlement, men's patriarchal entitlement to women's bodies and women's spaces.
Yes.
Then what is interesting to me about Xander in particular with regard to all of this gendered analysis that we're doing is that he is the one who brings inadequacy into it.
Yeah, no, he does. He does. And he throws that little fit. I'm inadequate. That's fine. I'm less than a man. It's like, yes, you are. You are a boy. You are literally less than a man.
Yep. Yeah.
And it's all about him too. Like when he follows Buffy out after she tells him to stay back because he will just be a hindrance on her. He follows her to the mausoleum and he says, because I couldn't just sit home and do nothing. because that's about
Right.
him. It's not about helping
Right.
Buffy. It's not even about saving Jesse. It's about him and the fact that he doesn't want to feel helpless in this circumstance.
And he doesn't want to let Buffy be responsible for his friend.
Yeah.
And he brings, I love this, he doesn't bring any of the tools that would help him to the, he brings a flashlight to the tunnel. So the tool he has is not only useless, but it's actually detrimental. You know, Buffy hisses at him to turn it off.
Right.
He's not contributing.
Right.
When she talks to him about being there and he explains that he wants to help and she tells him to leave, that pause, there is this unbelievably long pause before she allows him to come with her, before she gives up and lets him come along. And I really, really, really want there to be a line in there, something about, you are going to die. He's not
right.
You like, if you come with me, this is actual life and death that we're talking about here.
Right, but it's not life and death for Xander. It's about him allowing a woman to be in charge of this situation.
Yep.
You know, and allowing Buffy and trusting Buffy that she can handle it and that she's handling it. I mean, at this point, he knows that she is the vampire slayer. He knows that vampires are a real thing. He has seen her in action, you know, in the graveyard when she rescued both of them together. So at this point, he knows her power. He's seen her in action. He knows she's not helpless. And what he's not thinking about is the fact that he will actually be like a hindrance upon her. He will make her less effective by being there. But he's not thinking about this from any perspective other than his own.
He's so insecure about his role because his identity is so tied to being a man. He talks about standing around like an idiot, and Willow has to correct him. And she says, not like an idiot, just standing. He's the one who puts all of this negativity on not being an active participant in the fighting and the adventuring and the saving. It's not, you know, even when he brings up, you know, I'm less of a man, that wasn't a gendered conversation until he made it gendered. It had nothing to do with masculinity or femininity or who's a boy or who's a girl. It's Buffy is a superhero who fights vampires and you are a teenage boy. There is no reason for you to be fighting vampires. The end.
Exactly.
I just can't. I can't with Xander. I really can't. I mean, and then they get back to the library after they escape and he somehow helps her escape. She needs him to help her push the door closed on the vampire horde coming up.
Right. And that's the thing. Like, she is the strong one. That's the only time he's helpful. And she's like, come here, help me, you know? And somehow, like, she as the Slayer with her incredible amount of power is unable to shut a door unless he comes and shuts it for her, unless he comes and helps her.
And he pulls her out into the sunlight. But only after she tells him what to do. She says, Xander, pull.
Exactly.
And that's what gets the vampire hand out into the sun and, you know, lets her go. And then we're off and free. But they get back to the library and Buffy is calm and upset, but sort of handling it. And Xander goes kicking the recycling bin in the library because he's just so angry. He just has all this male anger, and the only way he can express it is by taking it out on a poor, unsuspecting recycling bin.
Right, to which everybody else has that shudder of response. You see Willow, you see Buffy, they're like, ugh, you know, like it upsets them because they have already also experienced everything that Xander has experienced. Right. But this moment is all about him and him being upset.
There is something sweet about his line, though, when he says, I don't like vampires. That there's something really dear and vulnerable about that. And then he's the one to realize when they're talking about where the vampires are going to go to feed, Xander's the one who realizes they're going to the Bronze. And there's a real sadness there. In his line. And I think that it's his grief over Jesse that enables him to make the connection that the vampires are going to the bronze. So,
yeah,
I mean, as much as I am suspicious of Xander, I mean, that feels unfair, but he is, I think there is some real genuine sweetness there too, and some real, I get a real sense of friendship between Xander and Jesse, even if some of their friendship is based on problematic male behavior. I think Xander has genuine friendly affection for Jesse.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jesse, human Jesse before he is vamped is still like an incredible douchebag. Like, he's still pretty terrible. And I actually really enjoy the relationship between Xander and Willow.
Yes.
There is this, I mean, she of course does a lot of his emotional labor. She's the one in that moment where she's like, not like an idiot, just standing. It's part of it is saying it is okay. Because you're a boy doesn't mean that you have to be the one taking all the action. So there's that. But it's also that she is patting him on the head and saying, no, you're okay. You're fine. And doing that emotional labor for the man, which is something that we see a lot, in real life and, reflected again in our stories. But I do like there's genuine affection between Willow and Xander. Willow sees everything. I think on a much broader sense, she has an understanding of everything in a way that Xander doesn't, but she has a great affection for Xander. And so there's a transference for me that I love Willow. I trust Willow. Willow loves Xander. There must be something in Xander that is, redemptive, that is worthy of Willow's affection.
I agree.
Which moves us nicely into having a discussion about Willow.
I love Willow so much.
I love Willow, but you know what? Willow for the first episode is essentially just walking vulnerability.
She really is.
You know, it's very clear from the beginning, she has this relationship with Xander. She is, it's given away in subtextual clues. It's not really in the text at all, but that she is, kind of in love with Xander. You can kind of see that in her. So she's vulnerable in that way. She's vulnerable to Cordelia, who is really, really nice to Buffy. And then all of a sudden, so nasty to Willow for absolutely no reason. It's like watching someone kick a puppy. And I love Cordelia for a lot of reasons, but that's really tough, watching her pick on Willow for absolutely no reason at all, just to be nasty, So Willow is romantically vulnerable. She's socially vulnerable. And she's in this situation where, Buffy comes and talks to her and says, I hear you're the one who's going to get me caught up. And she's like, well, you don't have to talk to me. Like, you can't hang out with both me and Cordelia. It just isn't done. Like, she is vulnerable in every way. And then at the end of the episode, she gets damseled, which is the act of putting a woman in danger so that she must be rescued. Of course, she's being rescued by Buffy. So it is not a traditional damseling in which we, dangle a woman in over the pit of danger in order to motivate a man and show how heroic he is. So at least we're subverting it in that way, that it is, an opportunity for Buffy, who has responded to Willow's incredible vulnerability with love and affection and kindness. And she just genuinely likes Willow from jump, which is really good. I love
seeing Buffy be kind to Willow. My absolute favorite moment might be that exchange between Buffy and Willow at the Bronze, where Buffy launches into, well, my philosophy. And then she stops herself and she says, do you want to hear my philosophy? And Willow says, yes. And I just cheered because that's what enthusiastic consent looks like.
Yes,
we're used to talking about
consent in all circumstances,
we're
right?
Used to talking about consent as non-consent. And it's like this scary conversation that no one wants to talk about consent. But I love that this is a great example of how to do consent, just properly and joyfully. And it's such a sweet exchange between the two of them. And Willow saying, oh, that's sweet about you might die tomorrow is just
right.
I just love
because she sees everything in this very bright, very positive way, and we're going to see Willow. I mean, when you talk about a character arc,
Oh, dear God.
When you talk about Willow going from the beginning of season 1 to the end of season 7, and as we're recording this episode of Still Pretty, I am finishing up my my run on season 7 in the video series for Still Pretty. So I'm looking at these two things concurrently, you know, Willow at the end of season 7 and Willow at the beginning of season 1, and how we have like this incredible arc for this character. But right in the beginning, we see that she has this innate positivity, that she will see things in the most positive way possible. She will see people in the most positive way possible. And even Cordelia, like her relationship with Cordelia, I find really interesting. Like Cordelia is the bully. Cordelia is being terrible to Willow and being just absolutely mean. And Willow, instead of fighting back, just kind of takes it, right? But then we get into the Harvest, where we have the scene with Cordelia and Harmony, who we don't see at her best yet, but who will become fast, like one of my favorite characters in the whole thing. Once Harmony turns, after Harmony becomes a vampire, Harmony the vampire is one of my favorite things in the whole run of Buffy and Angel. I absolutely love the whole thing. But Harmony, she's in the computer lab with Harmony. She's saying nasty things about Buffy. And it is when Cordelia says nasty things about Buffy, that's when Willow stands up. That's when Willow defends. Willow will not defend herself. Willow is not about the ego. But when it comes to defending people who are kind to her, people who are good to her, the people she loves, that's when she fights back. And then when Cordelia wants to know how to send it, she says, oh, deliver. And Cordelia hits the delete key and deletes all of her work, which is just a lovely way of getting back at Cordelia and thinking fast on your feet. Because if you know what DEL stands for on a computer, you know, keyboard, it would never occur to me to think of it as deliver, you know, because I know what it is. But she's so fast on her feet in that moment and making that, you know, making that assumption and sending it over to Cordelia. I think it's really beautifully done. And Cordelia gets hers.
And that little hint of the powerful Willow to come. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we transform her too from, I mean, in the first episode, she's all vulnerability and damsel, right? That's pretty much all she is. But we get into the Harvest and she's not just vulnerability and damsel. And she's not just, you know, ready to fight back when it comes to defending her friends. But now she's moving into Hacker Willow. She is the one who's able to wrest information from that dread machine, as Giles would say, right? So it's wonderful to see her given that capability, you know, and having a role to play in the group. Yeah, a role that suits her. And I think it's notable also that she remains very vulnerable, but she's also very intelligent. And I think we don't see a lot of that in female characters. We don't see the sort of sweet, innocent, kind character who is also very, very smart. And I think that we get a different version of that idea much later in Oz, who is the laid back, super chill guy who is also very intelligent. And I don't know if it's just that, you know, the folks at Buffy don't write characters who are not intelligent. Right. But because smart people write smart people. It's something that is really fun to see, that combination in Willow of sweetness and innocence and vulnerability, and also brains. You know, she's really, really smart. And courage. She is incredibly brave. You know, she doesn't have a moment where she's not ready to get in the fight, you know, and when they have that conversation, you know, she and Xander, after discovering that vampires are a thing, right? You know, and she says, everybody else thinks this is just a normal day, but we know, we have this knowledge. And through that knowledge, you are essentially changed. You know, that knowledge has a transformative power. And once you have that knowledge, you have that power. You have the power that comes with that. And with power comes responsibility. And Willow's first response to the power of knowledge is to take responsibility for it. Yes. I want to talk a little bit about, Willow gets me to Giles. And I want to talk a little, I want to talk a lot about Giles, but I want to talk a little bit about Giles and his relationships with Buffy and Willow.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I was really on the lookout because I'm suspicious of all men in film and television, apparently.
Which is a result of this patriarchal, subtext in everything. Like, let's just state right out, although it's, an hour in. So if you stop listening at this point because you think we're man haters, fine, whatever. For anybody who's left, like, we don't hate men. I love men. I mean, men are great, and men are hurt as much by the patriarchy
Absolutely.
as anybody else because they are not allowed to feel their emotions. They're not allowed to express their emotions, and then they end up expressing everything in terms of aggression and anger, and that is not healthy for men. In the same way that, white supremacy is bad for white
Exactly.
people. I'm going to talk about white supremacy throughout the run of this as well, and I'm going to say it's a bad thing. And it hurts white people the same way that the patriarchy hurts men. So anybody who is anti-white supremacy, anti-patriarchy, anti all of these oppressive systems is not anti the groups of people that benefit from those systems, because they benefit in ways that are actually not helpful to anyone.
Exactly. And in fact,
so I just want to state that outright.
no,
We don't hate men.
In fact, it is that patriarchal relationship that even makes me want to give Giles the side eye in the first place, right? Because Giles is nothing but affectionate and enthusiastic with the students that he interacts with. But because of these patriarchal systems where men own women and men are predatory by nature, I want to be suspicious of him. And even Buffy calls him on it. She makes a joke about it. She says, when she runs into him at the Bronze, she says, hanging out with partying with the students. Isn't that kind of skanky?
Right. Right. But he is there as a watchful eye. And we have this moment, too, that I love with Giles, which I think, contrasts nicely with Xander, because it was consciously done, whereas Xander's shadow self, I think, is unconsciously done. But with Giles, he has this, she says, well, why don't you kill the vampires? And he says, a watcher watches, and the slayer slays. He's like, my job is to impart wisdom, to prepare you. And she goes on that whole speech about prepare me. How are you going to prepare me for this? But he is completely comfortable with playing a supportive role, with being in a support position to the slayer who has the actual power. And at no point do I get any sense from Giles that his masculinity is in any way threatened by that.
I don't either. And I was watching for creepy boundary crossing older dude, and I didn't see any of it. I didn't see any of it at all. I mean,
no, there's never any sense of him seeing these, children as anything other than children. His role with them is paternal in the best way, paternal in a healthy, fatherly way. And it's really nice to see.
And when he says we call out his accent, he says that was a bit British, wasn't it? About his whole request to Willow, his proposal that Willow help him. And I wonder if he's very British to make him seem stuffy and asexual, so the audience isn't worried about him being alone with these teenage girls.
Yeah, maybe. Although I think that, first of all, there's nothing about Anthony Stewart Head that is asexual at all. The man is absolutely sexy. And I have to say, the first time I watched Buffy, I was a bit younger. But the more I watch it, the older I get, the more I'm like, Giles is hot, y'all. Giles is hot. He's smart. He's British. He is unthreatened by strong and powerful women. He is self-aware. He's smart. He is everything. If I could make a boyfriend out of materials that are just from Giles, I would absolutely do that.
Yeah. And he is happy to play that supporting role too. The glee with which he thunks down that giant vampire phone book. I mean, he is a nice counterpoint to Xander in that way, because he's so happy to play a supporting role. He has no he absolutely is. And he is a truly feminist character, and showing us the best ways in which feminism is beneficial for men, right? Giles is emotionally connected. Giles is intellectually curious. Giles is not wrapped up
you know, aggressive behaviors. He is analytical. He is smart. He plays a supportive role, knowing that being part of the team is important and in no way is threatened by that. These are all incredibly wonderful things. But what I find really fun and what I love about his enthusiasm in the beginning is that he approaches Buffy with this really, really, you know, huge amount of enthusiasm for vampires and dark things in the night. This is what he's been working for his whole life. And you have to think about this. He's a watcher. There are, as we will find out when the world building expands over the years, that there's a big group of watchers. There's a watchers council. There's all these people that you get prepared for being a watcher. I think his grandmother was a watcher or something like that, or maybe that's Wesley's grandmother. Somebody's mother or grandmother was a watcher at one point in somewhere in the canon. I don't remember where it came from. But we have all of this, you know, from him, and he is connecting with Buffy or interacting with Buffy solely in the realm of the Slayer, and she rejects that in the beginning, right? She wants to be the teenage girl. She wants to be the normal teenage girl. That is who she wants to be. That is the identity that she's working with, right? And he is working with the identity that she is actively trying to suppress at that point. You know, the Slayer identity, the superhero identity, the identity not just with power, but with huge amounts of responsibility. As I go back to quoting Marvel and Spider-Man again, with great power comes great responsibility.
But that's not a coincidence.
Right?
I feel like Buffy is Spider-Man in a lot of ways. And I mean,
she absolutely
I kind of want to get.
She's transformed through an accidental moment, and then her entire life is changed.
Yeah, and I kind of want to get Joshua Unruh on this. Buffy and Spider-Man.
Oh, yeah. We could definitely talk to Joshua Unruh. For those of you unfamiliar, Joshua Unruh is my co-host on Listen Up A-Holes, which is the Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast. His understanding of superheroes, you know, his tagline is the superhero scholar, and in no way is that, you know, like puffed up. He has earned every bit of that. He knows everything about superheroes, both in the canon of the stories from having such an incredibly deep knowledge of both DC and Marvel and basically all superhero comics throughout time, but he also has this deep understanding of the philosophy of the superhero. And it's interesting because over on Still Dead, the podcast about Angel that I'm doing with Kelly Jones, we're going to have him as a guest to talk about Angel. Is he a superhero or is he a mystery man? And I think we might have to have him as a guest here too to talk about the role of superheroes, especially with regards to women, femininity, and patriarchy smashing. So we'll definitely have to have him on.
That would be amazing.
That. But one of the things though that brings us to is this kind of like, I mean, the one character we haven't talked about yet is of course our title character, our titular character, right? Buffy.
Yeah.
You know, here we have Buffy, who is essentially split between these two identities, right? She's got this secret identity of the Slayer that she is actively rejecting. This is the identity, of course, that Giles is appealing to in the beginning and is slapped away, you know. But it is the essence of who she is. She cannot ignore or reject that identity. It is part of who she is. And as soon as, like, the moment that he's talking to her as the Slayer, you know, she rejects that. But after they find the dead guy in the locker, she comes in to tell Giles about it because she wants to pass off. She still feels responsible for it. She is still responsible. And she wants to pass off that responsibility to the adult. Let the adults handle this, you know? She cannot transfer that responsibility. And she ends up, of course, taking it on once the danger hits close to her, once it hits Willow. That is the moment that she actively embraces being the Slayer and goes out to protect Willow and Xander and Jesse, you know, these friends that she's made. But Buffy is really an interesting character in that she is, you know, the eponymous character. This is the character for whom this entire story is built. And yet Buffy sometimes I think ends up being one of the less interesting characters in the show, maybe because she has all of that weight on her shoulders, not just within the text and the world of the story, but also, you know, in the storytelling itself. She has to carry so much of what motivates and moves this entire story. So what are your feelings on Buffy?
I think it's interesting that we open in her unconscious mind. The first time we see her not in the opening credits is she's asleep. We open with her in bed and she's, you know, she's not sexualized at all in bed. She's a Buffy burrito, but we get her dream sequence as the first thing. You know, that's our first real contact with her. And I gotta say, I mean, that dream sequence at the beginning is like an engraved invitation to me. It's like, dear Noelle, we like symbols a whole lot. We take them very seriously, and they're everywhere. Have fun finding them. Your friends, the folks who made Buffy. Oh my God! Well, it's like it's this adorable, like, I mean, for my visual studies nerdy heart, I mean, it's fantastic. But we access Buffy through her unconscious, and that's a pretty big deal. I mean, that means that we're going along with Buffy and her experience. And that the show is going to have to take her thoughts and her desires and her pain seriously. I mean, she runs the show, literally. I mean, that's the advantage of being the titular character, right? But as a character, I mean, I did not find her as compelling in the first 2 episodes as everyone around her. I like that she's not especially afraid. I like that she's rejecting her identity as the Slayer, not because, you know, this is not news to her. She doesn't deny that she's the Slayer. I mean, she uses her super strength to break into the locker room. She doesn't pretend to be something she isn't. I mean, other than having the whole secret identity thing. This is a job for her. Being the Slayer is a job, and it's a job that she does not particularly want to do because she's experienced it already, thank you very much, and she would like to move on.
Right. And it kind of destroyed her life. She got kicked out of school. She burned down the gym at the old school. You know, I mean, it wasn't good for her.
Yeah. So I feel like we get to know kind of the idea of Buffy in the first 2 episodes, but not, you know, it's the pilot. There's not going to be a lot there for her to.
Well, yeah, the pilot has a ton of heavy lifting to do from a narrative perspective. A pilot has to set up the world. It has to set up the characters. It has to get your story moving. There's so many things that need to happen in a pilot, and it is one of the most difficult things, one of the most difficult challenges for a writer to take on. You know, it is incredibly heavy lifting to have to do.
Yeah, but I do think it's noteworthy that her experience is really what's going to drive us, and what that says about the show as a whole, that it's going to put that young female experience front and center. So we are experiencing the world how she experiences the world.
Yeah, right through her experience so deeply. And one of the things that I'm very excited to hear you say is how much you absolutely love dream sequences, because I hate them. From a symbolic point of view, dream sequences can be incredibly powerful. And I think from the point of view that you're taking this very visual, this very philosophical, this very deep, what do the symbols mean space, I think that it's going to be really interesting. And I love that you love them, because I think that you will redeem them for me. Because from a narrative point of view, dream sequences are often just very, very cheaply purchased exposition. And so I will say that because Buffy's prophetic dreams, you know, dreams that can tell what's going to happen, are part of the world building, and they're not used in this instance to give us exposition. They are used in this instance to show us that this is part of her experience, and we are very, very deeply in her POV and in her experience. So I will say I give the dream sequences throughout most of Buffy a pass, but when we get to Restless at the end of season 4, I am very much looking forward to you making that at all bearable for me, because I hate that episode.
I'll see what I can do.
I hate that episode. Yeah, I think you'll like it. I think it's going to be really good. So Buffy, I think, is interesting in this title role. She does have a lot of weight to carry, and the main protagonist always does. There are so many jobs that the protagonist has to fulfill narratively, which side characters usually don't, and which antagonists usually don't. I've always said I love writing antagonists, because antagonists have one job.
Yeah.
Right? All they have to do is block your character, your main character, your protagonist. And that's it. And then you can do anything else you want with them. Whereas with a protagonist, they have to have the most at stake. They have to be the one with the goal. They have to be in active pursuit of that goal. They have to be not necessarily likable, but definitely sympathetic. We have to build them in a way that we see them in a sympathetic way. Now, I think Buffy is also likable. Buffy's funny. She's obviously incredibly smart, which I really like seeing. It's not just about her being beautiful and strong and tough and powerful, but she's also very, very smart. And we see that in this classic signature Buffy quipping, which we sampled, a lot at the top of the episode with some of our favorite lines from these 2 episodes. But she's the fact that she can also go into these incredibly dangerous situations, these incredibly dangerous spaces, and instead of being a scared little girl, she's quipping, she's in control, she's being snarky with these demons that she's there to kill, And when you think about the fact that she is basically a child who has been tasked with killing, as her main, main purpose on this planet is to kill. And as we move forward in the world building, which we'll see as we move later, to kill and to be killed. Slayers don't last. Slayers don't hit old age. They don't die peacefully in their bed surrounded by, fat grandchildren. That's not something in the offing for a Slayer. Slayers have short, brutal lives. And so that's something else that as we move forward in the story, we are going to be talking about that also a lot. But I think that Buffy as a character is very likable. We do get a sense of her challenges. We don't see the deep vulnerability from her that we see in Willow and even in Xander.
True.
We don't, and even in Giles, I think we get more actual deep vulnerability. Vulnerability stems from, narratively, from a couple of things: fear, identity, love, and shame. And we see a lot of these things in Xander. We see definitely vulnerability stemming from the essential shame of who he is, that he is just essentially ashamed of himself and should be in a lot of ways. Giles, his vulnerability comes from love, not love for Buffy at this point because he's really just met her, but love for the work that he does. And when he has that incredible enthusiasm and is batted away from the person that gives his life meaning professionally, as a watcher, your life is given meaning by the Slayer. And he is the one watcher who actually gets the Slayer. That is obviously very important to him. So we see his vulnerability in that perspective, and Willow, of course, is nothing but walking vulnerability. We have fear for her life. We have her sense of herself and her identity. We have her love for Xander. And we have her shame at being, a nerd and, being like socially rejected. So we have all of that. With Buffy, I think we get a bit of her vulnerability in the sense of her identity. She does not want this rejected identity. She does not want to be the Slayer, but she's stuck with it. But we don't see a lot of real deep vulnerability from Buffy in these opening episodes. We will get a ton of vulnerability from Buffy throughout the run of the series. I don't think it becomes a problem. It is a problem throughout the run. But in the beginning, in this first episode, these 2 episodes, which essentially function as one story for the pilot, we do get, I think, a Buffy that is compelling, if not deeply vulnerable. It's the one thing that it's the one key to Buffy that we're kind of missing at this point in the story. And I think it puts you at a distance. Vulnerability brings you closer, and a lack of vulnerability pushes you further away. And vulnerability sourced from identity is the least, I think, powerful sense of vulnerability.
I could see that. That makes sense to me. We have one more character we haven't discussed. The mysterious man in the room. Talk about
the mysterious man in the room.
No vulnerability.
Talk about a character who will be rewritten from the bottom up very, very soon. So he almost doesn't count. Angel the vampire. We will discover him to be a vampire a little bit later, although at this point, I think you can probably guess that he has some relationship to that. We don't see him in daylight at all, and I think that that's a bit of a giveaway. He gives the cross to Buffy, safely ensconced inside of a jewelry case, and he does not touch it. So we have some clues, falling short of him walking in front of a mirror in which he is not reflected. We have some clues that he may be a vampire. But he also is fighting against these vampires. He is trying to prevent the harvest. He shares a goal with Buffy. But his behavior as he comes in, I mean, the angel that we come to know throughout the run of Buffy, and especially the angel that we come to know in his own series, is this guy has no relationship to that at all. He is smarmy and cocky, and not at all the angel that we are going to come to know, that we're going to get to know, like, even in the next episode. He is completely rewritten from the bottom up. And also the velour jacket. I mean, that is not okay. I don't care if you're a vampire.
It's the Dracula cape of the 90s.
No, the Dracula cape of the 90s, which we're going to see. We're going to see Angel adopt this, and we're going to see Spike later in the series adopt this, is the black leather duster. That is the cape. That is the vampire superhero cape.
I know better than to argue with your expertise.
Oh man, no, but the velour jacket is just it's a bad call. It is not at all the angel that we know. We will later get sort of this whole period retconned for us later on in the series as we go back into flashbacks of Angel's life before he, moved into Sunnydale and connected with Buffy. We're going to see that the angel that we see before that is so different. And so much more complex and so much more interesting than the angel that we're presented with in this episode. This cocky, instead of a floppy-haired douchebag, he's a spiky-haired douchebag. But a douchebag nonetheless.
I do not like him.
I do not like him, Buffy says, and neither do we.
No.
But no vulnerability. Mm-hmm. Exactly. We don't see much from this guy. But we do get a sense of him being also invulnerable. He is also incredibly cocky. He is incredibly quippy, but not in a way like Buffy that shows his strength. Instead, it feels like a veil that he hides behind. And so we don't actually see who he is. But your initial thoughts, so you don't know Angel as well as I do. Did you ever watch the TV series Angel?
I never did, no.
Oh, okay, well, you can watch it along with Still Dead as Kelly and I go through it. But yeah, like Angel, as we get to know him, this is not at all representative of him. But having less of a relationship with Angel, the character, than I do, what was your response to him?
I knew that he was a vampire, and I was watching for any sort of clues that the show gives us. I was curious to know, how soon does the audience figure out that he's a vampire? One of the first things he says to Buffy is, "I know what you're thinking. I won't bite."
Yeah,
and that's a great little clue there. But I was looking at him mostly he feels like a prop. He feels like world building to me. We see him as sort of made the costume design makes him really parallel to Buffy. When they meet, they're often wearing something that sort of coordinates. But that is some serious evil dude lighting on his face. I mean, he is a shifty dude. Especially the scene in the mausoleum, the right side of his face is lit, but the left side is completely shadowed. He's literally two-faced. He's both light and dark. And that's a visual leitmotif that
which he literally is. Yeah, I mean, as a character, he is both light and dark because he's the vampire with a soul.
And that's a visual leitmotif that we see throughout American film and television. I mean, you can look for it all over the place when somebody is hiding who they are, or we'll see it when somebody's not telling the truth. We'll see it when somebody is maybe only showing us part of the truth. we'll see that.
Right. Or we'll see it when a director just decides that's how they want to light the scene. I mean, sometimes a cigar
True.
is just a cigar.
And sometimes, the X-Files did it and it looked great. So we're going to do it on Buffy too.
Yeah.
We're going to make it super dark. But I suspect that we're going to see a lot of that sort of film noir lighting as we go through Buffy. And of course, meanwhile, in that same scene, there's all of this lovely key light on Buffy's face, and Sarah Michelle Gellar looks like a baby.
I know, my God, she was such a child.
Babies. They're all babies, even the ageless vampires.
I know.
It's pretty great.
Well, there is actually another character that I wanted to talk about just a little bit. And I think this character, as we were talking about how deeply we are in Buffy's POV throughout this story, I think that Joyce is kind of a victim of that as well, because we have her mother, Joyce, who basically simply exists to be the mom, the annoying, mom who loves you and is nurturing and whatever, but is also really annoying and trying to connect with Buffy and trying to understand Buffy, but she can't, right? Because the big metaphor of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, at least in the start, is this idea that high school is hell, right? So we are taking that from metaphor and bringing it into this fantasy realization, within the realm of Buffy, where the high school actually sits on top of a Hellmouth. That it is spewing hell throughout the hallways of this high school and this experience. And of course, Buffy is constantly torn between her domestic reality, her everyday mundane reality, which is during the daylight hours, and then her superhero reality, which is at night, right? Because at night is when the vampires come out, and that's when she has to become superhero Buffy, and she has to kind of change and transform, not entirely unlike a werewolf when the full moon comes out, which is another thing we'll be seeing later on. We talked about Oz a little bit, and we teased that a little bit, and we will be seeing that more. But here we have Joyce, who is simply kind of an annoyance, kind of a fly to swat at. We don't really see her as a complete character into herself. And again, early stages, this is, the pilot episode, the two episodes that function as a pilot. We're establishing a ton of things and getting everything in there with depth and complexity, especially in these subplots, which is not really, a big thing in this episode. We don't really have time or energy to make Joyce consistent, but she's basically like a cardboard antagonist to just throw up a roadblock whenever we need it. That isn't necessarily motivated by who Joyce is, and we're going to see this happen actually a lot through the first couple of seasons, where Joyce just simply exists to be a problem in the moment. Whether that's consistent with the problem that she was last week or not is really not our concern. So we end up seeing Joyce that no matter what she says, no matter what she does, she is always a problem for Buffy, and so I'm interested to see, did you have any thoughts about Joyce? Did Joyce even land on your radar watching this, without all of that, deep Buffy perspective? I've been, sinking into Buffy for the last, 5 years of my life, constantly on a daily basis. So for you, who's not so deeply ensconced in this world, what did you see?
Not so deeply ensconced yet.
Yes, I know. I'm pulling you in, baby.
I don't have a lot to say about Joyce. She really, in what we see of her, she's really just the mom. I like the little bit of a nod to Joyce with a mind and a character of her own, where she says no, and then she says, "The books all say I should get used to saying it. No." She's trying so hard to be a good mom, you guys. And I mean, but she really is just there as the mom.
Yeah, as the opposite, right? And the opposite to Giles, which I find really interesting, because we have Joyce, the feminine, representing the daily part of Buffy, the daily identity of Buffy, the identity that she is during when the sun is up, that it is this domestic, it is the nurturing, it is the mundane, right? Joyce is the essential representation of the mundane, whereas Giles is the representation of the mystical. And the mystical is actually more real than the mundane, in this context, because the mystical is metaphor, is reality being transformed through metaphor into a different reality. you know? So I find it really interesting that, you know, we have this kind of reflection of the masculine and the feminine, you know, and that Giles is the one who is kind of presiding over the reality that is actually more real because it is emotional reality as opposed to like actual literal reality, which is what Joyce represents. So I think that it's kind of interesting. And I often think, as much as I love Giles, you know, how this would have worked had we flipped that and had Buffy's dad, you know, not the dad that we actually get in Hank Summers because he's a useless piece of garbage, but a good parent dad, you know, at home representing domesticity, representing the mundane, and then a woman, a female slayer, or female watcher, I'm sorry, you know, in the role, like connecting Buffy to actual reality, to what things really mean, you know? And how that would have been interesting.
That definitely would have read like a much more pointedly gendered story.
It would, but I think it's better the way that it is. And the reason why I say that is because we have a role for the masculine within this actual reality, within the truth reality, within the bedrock of reality, which is Buffy's existence as the Slayer. Demons are real, vampires are real, all of this stuff, right? That I like that we have a strong role for a man that's emotionally connected. He's not the nurturing domestic force, you know, that Joyce is, or that Joyce represents, but he is a nurturing, strong, supportive male role model. And I think that we need that within. Feminism is not about everything is all girls all the time, girl power. Feminism is about creating a space in which both men and women get to be all parts of themselves, that they're not restricted to whatever the patriarchy decides. The patriarchy decides that men need to be aggressive and assertive and powerful, and women need to be meek and sweet and pretty, and domestic and nurturing, right? That Giles can be nurturing. Giles can be sweet, and we're going to see him be that a lot. Buffy can be powerful within the actual reality that lies underneath this false mundanity.
Absolutely. And we have a sort of preview of coming attractions with Giles and Buffy and their relationship when he says, "I don't have to tell you to be careful," and gives her that look as she's going out the door. And I just see that sort of, that nurturing presence shows up pretty early. But it is, I agree that I think it works a lot better having the feminine adult in the domestic space, and then having this positive, non-toxic masculinity in the school space, in the mystical space, in the true identity space. I think it's really well done.
I think so too. I think it works out really well. All right. So I think we're, winding things up here a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit about our first big bad. Now, one of the things that Buffy does is that every season we have a big bad that is introduced. In this episode, it's right from jump. Usually we wait until about episode 3 in the longer seasons, but this is a 12 episode season. We don't have time to mess around here. We're moving forward. So we have the big bad introduced in the Master, and the Master, I think, becomes more interesting and more complicated as we move forward. Here he truly is just the grotesque, the grotesque, ultra evil, representation in this episode. What did you think of the Master?
I really liked his scenery chewing.
Yes.
It just made me really happy. He just really goes for it.
Yeah, he does.
We talked about it a little bit already. I like his relationship with Luke. I think that is interesting. But I think there's just something so great about him to me, with how dramatic he is and how much he just is. He's really going for it.
He is. He's holding nothing back. Played by Mark Metcalf, who is absolutely delightful, I think, in the role. I
do love that 90s CGI when he rises out of the the blood.
Sure.
The
The special
bloodbath.
effects.
Yeah.
The special effects, the dusting, everything is really rough in the beginning with very little budget for this thing. And a lot of it is done off screen.
Yes.
We have a lot of things that are done. Like some of the dusting is done off screen. We're very, very careful about a lot of this, partially because of, I'm sure, violence and standards and practices, and partially because we just simply didn't have the budget.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the master pokes the eye off screen.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of off screen violence in these first
off screen
couple episodes. And I'm sure some of that is for budgetary reasons. And I think some of it is also just they didn't know what they were going to be able to get away with yet.
Yeah, and also there is an aesthetic reason to putting things off screen. I mean, if you can do something off screen and indicate it with sound effects, for instance, the eye poking, right?
Yes.
That can actually be more powerful. What we don't see can be more powerful than what we actually see. Sound effects are one of the most powerful tools for any visual artist, for anybody working within TV and film. And used appropriately, you can create things that are actually more powerful because we don't see them. So I think that playing with what is on screen and what is off screen can both be a function of budget and a function of actual aesthetic choice. I feel here it was a function of budget because the aesthetic choice and the way that it was pulled off was not necessarily that strong.
Yes.
And the aesthetics of these first few episodes, like the first season in general of Buffy, is not great. The directing in these episodes was pretty bad. I think that The Harvest was better than Welcome to the Hellmouth, but Welcome to the Hellmouth was just a mess. We had some shots where people are blocked, like you see the back of somebody's head, and so you don't see like all of Cordelia in that scene where they're all talking in the courtyard there at the school. There were so many shots that I was looking at, and I was like, what in the hell are you even doing? Like, is this your first job? Like, I mean, I don't want to throw any shade at the director, but I was like, I don't even know what's going on here, because some of the shots were just bad. They just were not well done. They were not evocative. They didn't work. And the aesthetics, of course, of every show will evolve as the show evolves. And we do see the aesthetics of Buffy evolving throughout. Almost every season has a different kind of visual aesthetic. We graduate it, we evolve it, we make it more complicated throughout each season. They never just sit back and do one thing. In Buffy, it is constantly moving and constantly evolving, both in the storytelling and in the visuals of how they tell those stories. But for the big bad for first season and for, establishing in the pilot, I feel like we've established who the Master is. We established that he is bad news, that he is difficult, that he even, will stick his finger in the eye of his vampires, of his team, and he is truly, truly evil. So it's kind of fun. It was kind of fun to play with them. So in Still Pretty, just like everything else that we do at Chipperish Media, we are going to finish on a positive note. So no matter what it is that we're talking about, we can finish positively. And given that Welcome to the Hellmouth and The Harvest are good episodes, we didn't have a whole lot of negative stuff to say. But I want to go ahead and move into what's your favorite part. So Noelle, can you tell me, what is your favorite part of these two episodes?
Oh my gosh. I have several favorite parts.
All right.
But the one that just cracks me up so much is when the vampires are figuring out that there's a slayer. Yeah. And the Master wonders out loud about proof of a slayer, and asks Luke if he has any proof that there's a slayer, and Luke says, "Only that she fought me and yet lives." And the Master says, "Very nearly proof enough. I can't remember the last time that happened." And Luke hangs his head and says, 1843, Madrid. He's been thinking about it this whole time.
Right.
I just headcanoned that's like, that was deeply distressing to him.
He needs a little therapy. He needs to be able to move on.
Yeah, he still has not moved on from that experience. Right. All right. So what was your favorite part, Lani?
For me, it was the prepare me speech. You know, when Giles says, oh, a watcher trains, he prepares her. And Buffy's like, prepares me? How are you going to do that? For getting kicked out of school, losing all my friends, having to spend all my time fighting for my life? You know, go ahead, prepare me for that. And I love that moment because we're going to see that reflected more passionately in the season finale for season 1, Prophecy Girl. So we're going to reflect back on that again because she's going to have that speech not about preparing her to fight, but preparing her to die. Like how does she deal with that? How does she accept that? You know? And it's in Prophecy Girl, I think, is the moment when Buffy becomes Buffy, you know, when we really see what Buffy is capable of. But this is a nice sort of precursor to that. This is the moment in the opening episodes that grabs my attention and says, okay, we're doing something here. We're doing something real with this. We're not skimming over the fact that this girl is going to live every day of her life in mortal peril, you know? Yes. And what that means to somebody who is 16 years old and just wants to be a cheerleader, you know? So, so I kind of love that because it has the sense of anchoring in reality, of not tiptoeing past the heavy stuff and the dark stuff that Buffy is actually famous for. Buffy will address the darkness, you know, and that's what makes it, I think, so good at what it does because it's playing in this horror space, but it is not ignoring what the darkness means as opposed to just, you know, how scary it is and how gross it is to see, you know, a master vampire poke out another vampire's eye, you know. It's not about the thrill and it's not about the being afraid. It's about the very real, you know, issues of what is it, you know, to the whole of Buffy, not just the superhero of Buffy, but to these two parts that are warring with each other, you know, to become integrated. You know, what does that mean for her? And I love that because that's the moment that speaks to, it's the first whisper of what Buffy will become.
To join in the discussion on Twitter, follow Lani at Lani Diane Rich and me at Noelle LaCroix and use the hashtag StillPretty. But the best place for all the great discussion is on the Patreon Discord chat. Just $1 a month of support gets you in with some of the smartest Buffy geeks around.
Absolutely. You can also show your support for Still Pretty by going to Apple Podcasts and giving us a review. That's one of the most effective ways to show support for your favorite podcast. So anybody that you're listening to, if you could take a few minutes to just give them a review on Apple Podcasts, that is a huge way to show your support. Or use a social media platform of your choice and just let everybody know that we're out here. Word of mouth is an incredibly powerful thing.
Definitely. We will be back next time with Witch, the 3rd episode of season 1. Until then, stay pretty.